Hello and welcome into BTN's Take 10 podcast. This is Alex Roux of BTN.com. I want to welcome you into another football-focused edition of the Take 10 podcast. Football Focus is what we call the episodes each week during the college football season where we bring in a national writer to give their perspective, not only on Big Ten football, but of the national college football picture as well. And this week, and this should come as no surprise if you've been listening to previous episodes this year on the Take 10 podcast, this week we're bringing in another writer from The Athletic. The Athletic, the online subscription-based sports website that is dominating sports coverage lately. We have another one of their writers on this week for their perspective on the like I said, the national college football picture and Big Ten as well. And that writer is Max Olson. He covers college football nationally for The Athletic, and just like his colleagues, Chantel Jennings, Brian Hamilton, we had on the previous 2 weeks, he had a lot of great things to say, a lot of cool insight as we approach one of the biggest Big Ten matchups of the season between Ohio State and Penn State, and a big weekend nationally is waiting us as well. So we definitely got into all the marquee matchups coming up, broke down what happened this past weekend as well, and we got into what he writes about weekly for The Athletic, which is stop rate, a defensive metric that measures the, as it sounds shockingly, the rate of stops a team produces and ranks them 1 through 130 or however many college football teams there are. So definitely want to get into his weekly stop rate column as well. Brings a unique wrinkle to how we evaluate college football defenses and teams in general. So we got into that and much more coming up here in our interview with Max Olson. Beyond that, we also had a discussion with Harold Shelton. We do a weekly segment called Stat Head where we dive into the numbers, both past and present for Big Ten football. We took a look at what happened this past weekend, especially the Iowa-Wisconsin game, and next weekend with the aforementioned Ohio State-Penn State matchup in Happy Valley. So plenty to talk about with Harold. Went about 20 minutes with him, which is a little longer than we usually go, but it was definitely packed with a lot of useful information. So stay tuned for this segment with Harold after my interview with Max Olson. All right, before we get to the interview with Max, just a quick reminder that you can subscribe to the Take 10 podcast on Google Play, iTunes, Podbean, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, Big Ten Network's YouTube channel. That's on YouTube, where all of the Take 10 podcast episodes are hosted in a playlist. So subscribe to YouTube, Big Ten Network channel for all our great highlights, all our great content, and you can find the Take 10 podcast there as well. Definitely subscribe if you're listening on SoundCloud, and leave a rating and a review if you like the show. Always appreciate that feedback. All right, so now we'll get into our first interview of this week's episode of the Take 10 podcast. Like I said at the top, it's with The Athletic's Max Olson, and that interview starts right now. Very pleased to be joined by a national college football writer for The Athletic. He's a University of Nebraska grad. You can follow him on Twitter at Max_Olson. It's Max Olson. Max, welcome. How's it going today?
Good, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. Max, you're the fourth weekly guest I've had on so far this football season, and 3 out of those 4 guests have come from The Athletic. So congratulations to you guys on all your continued growth. And I'm pretty sure I work for The Athletic now, and I just don't know it yet. So be sure to let me know if you guys hire me.
How about this, little world takeover we're attempting here? No, I appreciate you. Appreciate you supporting the site, and I've been with them for a year now, covering college football, and it's been a lot of fun working with Stuart Mandel and Bruce Feldman and those guys to kind of get this thing rolling here. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we definitely enjoy having you guys on. You're following up this season Brian Hamilton and Chantel Jennings, so no pressure.
Oh yeah, well, 2 of our absolute best writers. So your listeners here are. I feel bad for them, but we'll try and get through it.
All right, sounds good. And while I have you on, let's jump right into it and get into what was a weird weekend overall in college football. And we'll actually start in the Big Ten, which is relatively tame compared to what went down nationally. So I'll just start with some initial impressions. What I do with each guest is kind of get their 30,000-foot view of what went on. So just big picture out of the Big Ten, what were some initial impressions of what you saw out of this conference last weekend?
I think the thing that stood out to me, first of all, really impressed by just the continued growth of Dwayne Haskins. I think you saw, obviously they're playing Tulane, and that results about what do you expect, but he has really been lighting it up. And I think he's if he can have a big game this weekend, I think you have to talk about him, right there with Tua Tagovailoa as really the top of the heap in terms of Heisman contenders, and just really impressed by his accuracy and the way that Ohio State's passing offense continues to really be a huge step up from what we saw last year. Obviously, Wisconsin-Iowa was that was a lot of fun to watch. Impressed by the way Wisconsin was able to hold on and put it away there. In obviously a really tough road environment for any team in the Big Ten. And then Nebraska, Michigan, man, what a statement that was from Michigan. To hear Michigan players basically say after the game that after the first drive they knew Nebraska was going to quit and didn't want it. I mean, that just tells you the level of confidence that Michigan has right now. They're able to just run, pound the rock and really break Nebraska's confidence really quickly. And obviously this has been a tough run so far for Scott Frost in getting started there. Having an injured quarterback has not helped, but really just a very dominant statement by Michigan to jump on Nebraska and be up 39-0 at halftime. That says a lot about just where Michigan's at as a program, and it definitely shows you how dangerous they can be.
Yeah, and before we get to the national picture, I want to unpack some of those observations a little bit individually here. As I mentioned at the top, you're a Nebraska guy, so I imagine you follow that program with a little, closer of a microscope than most. And the lead up to this game was hyped up a bit because of the history between the programs and that split 1997 national title. But as you mentioned, the game itself was all Wolverines, and that 56-10 result left no doubt and sent the Huskers to their first 0-3 start since 1945. So can you kind of get deeper into this rocky start? What are your thoughts on how it, projects, I guess, the image of the program, if it matters at all, just because Scott Frost doesn't have his guys in yet? Is there anything to be concerned about long-term from what you've seen, or is this just a bumpy start that, really never got with a program that never really got its footing under it because they were rained out week one and then had a tough opponent week two, and the wheels just kind of fallen off since then?
Yeah, it's been I don't want to say it's been like a nightmare start, but it has been definitely the thing that Nebraska fans, probably they didn't think it'd be this rough. I think in getting to visit them this spring and during fall camp, I think the expectation was, that they had a better talent than they showed last year at 4-8, and that they felt like this could be a 6-8 win team, just based on, getting that culture right, having a lot better situation there with that coaching staff with Scott Frost, who really understands, what it takes to be successful in Nebraska. And like I said, they felt like they had good players there. And I think that the way this thing has started is just, you couldn't draw it up any worse. I mean, you lose that Akron game at the start, which I think would have been important for Adrian Martinez and their offense to really kind of work through the kinks early on and kind of get comfortable. And then you go in and play a good Colorado team, an experienced Colorado team that's got its act together, and you lose a tight game. You lose Adrian Martinez during that game, and then Troy was, I'd spent some time with Troy. I wasn't surprised that program, really impressed by Neil Brown and his staff and his players. Really, what can you say? Troy was better that day in Lincoln and deserved that one. And then now you're at 0-3 after losing to Michigan. And look, you knew the schedule was going to be really, really difficult for Scott Frost in his first year at Nebraska with the number of road games they play. They're playing at Michigan, at Wisconsin, at Northwestern, at Ohio State, at Iowa. I mean, that's brutal. And it's going to get a lot easier in 19. And you'd expect them to take a bigger step in 19. But, it is surprising that this is now kind of looking, if you just go over that schedule, it is starting to look like a team that's, now they're talking about trying to win 3 or 4 games instead of 6, and that's a part of that is I'm sure hard to swallow for Nebraska fans. But when you have a head coach that you believe in, I'm sure that they need to just kind of understand that this is rock bottom, and it's going to get better from here. And that, that if you give this staff time to bring in the players they need, that this thing will turn around. But, it's interesting. It is a lot similar to what you saw at UCF. The first year was tough, and the second year really took off. I'm not saying they're going to do that in Lincoln, but this is part of it. It's a rebuilding process, and it's going to take a lot longer time, I think, than maybe the fan base probably thought.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with our Fox colleague here, Joel Klatt, who said if there's such a thing as Nebraska stock, buy it all now. And I agree with you that it's hard to replicate what happened at UCF, but the blueprint's there, and I think they have the right guy. I don't think there's any reason for major concern, even as unfortunate as these first few weeks have been for Nebraska. So we'll keep it in the West now. And you mentioned the Wisconsin-Iowa game. That was the marquee game of the weekend in the Big Ten. It was an entertaining game to watch. Not a whole lot of offensive fireworks, but Wisconsin now is kind of in that early driver's seat in the West with the 28-17 victory. Alex Hornibrook kind of did what he was able to do in last year's Big Ten championship game by leading a game-winning drive. So my question for you is, did Wisconsin show you enough by going into Kinnick Stadium, a tough environment, winning by 11 to prove that they're kind of back in this national picture? Do they have quite a bit of work to do still, to prove that, I guess, they're back in the good graces of a national media member like yourself?
Yeah, I think obviously for that Wisconsin team, to be able to bounce back from BYU and kind of get things right and go into this game and get a really clean performance from Alex Mornybrook, for him to go 17-22 with 205, 3 touchdowns, no picks. I mean, that's all you can ask for a guy like that in a road environment against a tough defense. So yeah, it's definitely a strong performance from Wisconsin. A good effort from Jonathan Taylor, and look, I think this team with that offensive line and with the pieces they have, there's no doubt they're front runner in the West, and I don't really know what you make of the rest of the West at this point, but I think you have to look at Wisconsin as the team that it was going to get right after BYU and get back to what they're doing, and so I think a nice statement, a step in the right direction. Definitely not a team that's a finished product by any means, but even if Iowa's not ranked, I mean, that's a quality opponent, and that's a quality road win.
Yeah, I think Iowa will, if they take care of business, go through this season for most of the second half of the season ranked in the top 25. If BYU can stay in that top 25, the loss won't look nearly as bad. Maybe we're looking at Wisconsin like we were in the preseason before too long here. So before we move on to the national picture, just want to touch on that last topic that you actually brought up first, and that was Dwayne Haskins and the dominance that he's shown so far. And, we've seen basically a lot of QB uncertainty and switches at high-profile schools, including Clemson and Notre Dame throughout the country. But like you mentioned at the top, one school there's been no such uncertainty as Ohio State. He's been really brilliant, completing passes, 76% rate. He's tossed 16 touchdowns, just 1 pick. And, there's a couple ways, I think, of evaluating his performance so far. They've played 3 pretty weak teams, which can mean those numbers are a bit inflated, but he's also been pulled very early in those games. So those numbers, would probably be even more ridiculous if he'd played the full 16 quarters that his team has played so far. So how does he compare? I haven't seen much of Tua. I've seen his numbers, but just watching the Big Ten, I haven't seen much of Tua at Alabama. He's obviously off to a similarly impressive start. How does he compare to Tua, and who else might be in that Heisman conversation with those two guys?
Yeah, I think the guys in that conversation beyond those two, I think that Will Grier at West Virginia has been off to a really nice start, and that's a team that's a top 15 team that I think is going to stay in the national picture here for a while. And I think Kyler Murray from Oklahoma has just been phenomenal as a dual threat guy, and really carrying on what he inherited from Baker Mayfield there. And so they've been a lot of fun to watch, but I think Dwayne Haskins, has done everything right, everything you'd want to see so far. Like you said, video game numbers, hitting 76%, 16 touchdowns, 1 pick, and 54.5 points per game, which is encouraging to see. And the fact is the guy's only thrown 3 passes in the fourth quarter this year. So I think that's why the Penn State game is so fascinating as kind of a litmus test for where he's at, because he hasn't really been put in that position yet to have to win a game in the fourth quarter. I mean, they put TCU away in the third, and a lot of that was kind of thanks to turnovers from TCU and some great defense. But I'm really fascinated to see how Haskins can handle Penn State, and he has the pieces around him at receiver and at running back, just like Tua. I think to really set him up for success, and that's a really good quarterback situation they've got there in Columbus, because I think Tate Martell, it's been good to see him get his reps and get a little experience. I think he's got a really bright future, but Haskins, he's waiting for this chance, and man, he's really taking advantage.
Yeah, and I love that stat that he's only thrown the 3 fourth quarter passes. I didn't realize it was that few. That's remarkable. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So like you said, I don't anticipate staying that low with the upcoming trip to Happy Valley, but we'll see. All right, I want to break it out nationally now. And I want you to get us up to speed, if you could, with kind of your elevator speech for the national picture from this last weekend, for those who didn't get to watch what went down on, like we mentioned earlier, what was really a wacky weekend across the country. So what jumped out at you from week 4 across college football?
Just the chaos at night was a lot of fun to watch. You start that off with Virginia Tech playing a road game at Old Dominion and losing, which the odds of that happening were just extremely slim. And what an impressive performance from Old Dominion to win 49-35 with a backup quarterback in the game. Just really took it to Virginia Tech, put up 28 points in the fourth quarter. And that's what we love about this sport. We love that you write that off as an easy automatic win, but every once in a while that you get that kind of Cinderella story of something crazy happening. And we had a nice amount of upsets, I think, in the night schedule on Saturday that were fun to watch. Kentucky had a surprisingly easy time taking down Mississippi State. You saw Texas Tech really make a really nice statement with a 41-17 win at Oklahoma State in Stillwater, something they haven't done in a very long time. And then, you had a couple of really close calls. You had Oklahoma going to overtime with Army. Obviously, you had Wisconsin surviving that game late, and Arizona State gave Washington everything they had. So, and then of course, last but not least, you got Stanford, Oregon, which was a game that seemed completely heading in Oregon's direction. They were about to make it, I think, 31-7 until a call was called back, and then suddenly, suddenly it flips and Stanford catches up. Oregon fumbles when they should be kneeling, and you got overtime, and you got a Stanford win. So it was just that, I felt like it was a little bit of a snoozer during the day, week 4, but a lot of fun at night, a lot of crazy stuff going on, and just kind of a reminder that's one of the things that makes the sport great, is just kind of the chaos that you don't anticipate from week to week.
Yeah, what surprised you most? Was it Oklahoma nearly losing to Army, like you mentioned, Oregon blowing that game in what was nearly inconceivable fashion? I couldn't believe it, just kind of following on Twitter. Or Virginia Tech losing to Old Dominion. And beyond that, even beyond what surprised you most out of those three, what is the, I guess, national implication for two top 10 teams in Stanford and Oklahoma as they, look to remain playoff contenders going forward?
Yeah, I think Old Dominion would be the most shocking, but man, that Army-Oklahoma game was a lot of fun to follow, just because, it's bizarre that this is the case in 2018, but that game was actually on pay-per-view, and so nobody could actually watch it. And so the fact that Army, was able to kind of put Oklahoma to the test and do what they did best. They had 4 drives that were like 10 minutes long. That were, 15 plus plays. Army did what they do best and really took, one of the top offenses in the country and kept them on the bench for 45 minutes of the game. And so just so impressed by Jeff Monken and his staff and what they were able to do in Norman. And just a reminder that why playing those triple option teams is, such a nightmare. Remind me, what was the other question?
Yeah, I just want to know, like, with Oklahoma and Stanford still being top 10 teams and Stanford now having a test with Notre Dame, did those results kind of impact how you project those two programs and their playoff aspirations going forward?
Yeah, definitely impressed by Stanford. Just a really tough team. I think you saw in the way they were able to catch up that they've got some offensive firepower this year, and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside has been a real playmaker for them at receiver, and it's not just the Bryce Love show. And so I think that balance on offense as Costello grows up at quarterback has been nice to see. And yeah, another big one for them, this week with Notre Dame, and then Oklahoma's got to play Texas next week. So just when you think that just when you kind of pat yourselves on the back and feel good about yourselves for a minute, you got another big game coming up. So I really like this Stanford team. I think they're really tough, and I think they have a really a good shot against this Notre Dame team that just made a change at quarterback and is still figuring things out a little bit. And Oklahoma, I think, will keep rolling, and I think that game was probably an aberration, but suddenly Texas is a lot better, and I think that game in Dallas next weekend, I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Just because Oklahoma wasn't on TV, that's why they didn't get up for it. We'll just go with that.
That's right.
So I'll use the Notre Dame talk to kind of segue into discussion about Michigan, because they've looked really impressive since their opening week loss to Notre Dame. Based on what you've seen out of the Irish and the Wolverines since that week 1 game, do you think this year could maybe be different for Michigan than the past few have been under Harbaugh, where they really beat up on inferior competition, and then once the big games come up, that's when historically under Harbaugh they've shrunk from that moment, or have you not been able to tell just because of the quality competition that Michigan has faced, and maybe you don't know enough about Notre Dame quite yet?
Yeah, I think that's still hard to tell, just because, like you said, ultimately you're going to be judged on how you play in those big games and not the ones that they've handled the last couple of weeks here. I think the takeaway from the Notre Dame game obviously was there was a team that still had a good amount to figure out. I think that as I expected at least, they still had to kind of figure out how they were going to best, kind of shape that offense around Shea Patterson, because, that's a different dude now. That's a guy that wants to play a little bit more like Johnny Manziel and scramble around and create. And so how do you kind of adjust his game, and how do you adjust your game around him? And I think they're doing a better job of that. Obviously, against Nebraska, they just had to run the ball. That's all they had to do, and it was really, really, really easy. And but just really impressed by that Michigan defense. Obviously, we talk all the time about Don Brown and what a genius he is, but just the playmakers they have, across the field there. Really impressed by them and the way that they were able to, get after Nebraska. And I think they're taking steps in the right direction. And obviously, you just want to know, how's this going to show up against Wisconsin? How's it going to show up against Penn State and Ohio State? So, I mean, that's what you're building towards. And I think the last few weeks they've done a nice job of making that progress and taking those baby steps. And man, we'll see when it's time for the big one. But I like where they're at.
Yeah, and it's all speculation, like you said, at this point. We'll find out soon enough with Michigan, as they'll face Wisconsin, Michigan State, and Penn State back to back in a few weeks here. So we won't have to wait too much longer. And luckily, we don't have to wait at all, really, for a massive matchup in the Big Ten, because number 4 Ohio State pays that visit to number 9 Penn State this weekend, and I want to dive deep into that in just a moment. And before we do that, though, I did want to put some of these Big Ten teams in context nationally with a method you use and write about for The Athletic, and that method is called Stop Rate. And it's a ranking system I really like because, one, it's simple and dummies like me can understand it, but it also helps give a good sense of defensive effectiveness in today's fast-paced college football. So, first off, can you explain what Stop Rate is and how you started using it in a weekly column for The Athletic?
Yeah, for sure. So Stop Rate is really, really basic. It's to me, I wanted to find a little bit different defensive metric to judge these teams, because as you go conference to conference, some are playing really high tempo, some are playing a lot more plays than others. I think as the offenses have evolved in college football over the last decade, I think that yards per game doesn't really matter like it used to, and I think in some ways points per game doesn't necessarily tell you how effective your defense is. So Stop Rate is basically it's simple enough. It's of all the drives that your defense plays, what percentage of them are they able to get a stop? Are they able to get either a turnover or a punt or a turnover on downs or missed field goal, anything to avoid giving up points? And so the Stop Rate standings that we do each week on The Athletic are really just all 130 teams nationally. Just how do they compare in Stop Rate and how frequently they're getting a stop and getting off the field, and then also looking at points per drive, because I think points per drive is a lot more kind of telling statistic at this point than points per game, just because of the way that the Big Ten plays at a different tempo than the Big 12 and Pac-12 and all that. So trying to find some way to give you a better sense of just who's been the most effective. And so right now it's, as you'd expect, Alabama's near the top, Georgia's near the top, LSU's doing really well. The number 1 team in the Big Ten right now is Iowa. I've got them 7th this week in the Big Ten, or in the Stop Rate standings. They're getting stops on 83% of their drives, only giving up 1.13 points per drive. So, that's even after the Wisconsin game. They've done a really nice job of shutting teams down and getting off the field and giving their offense a chance to get out there and score some points. So Iowa's best in the Big Ten at that right now. Minnesota's behind them at 81%. But it's one of those deals. Like I said, as this game kind of continues to change, we need to try and figure out different ways to look at it. It's not some opponent adjusted super data heavy stat. It's just pretty basic. Are you getting the job done or not? And Big Ten teams have traditionally fared really well in that, and I'm curious to see how it kind of continues to shake out. And over the next month or so, as you get more games under your belt, then you kind of get a better sense of really who the best defenses in the country are. Yeah,
as the sample size moves on, I'm sure we'll, like you said, get a better idea of some of those best defenses, not only in the Big Ten, but across the country, and I encourage everyone to check that out. Another piece I wanted to ask you about that you've written for The Athletic is about this 4-game in transfer trend that we've seen kind of start to take shape across college football. The new rule was in place this year in college football. I want you to kind of explain not only the rule with the 4 games and then redshirt strategy, but also kind of this trend, like I said, of transferring, especially if, as we saw at Oklahoma State just yesterday, when you don't, maybe don't get the playing time or the results you wanted, you bolt for somewhere else.
Yeah, so essentially this hasn't really hit the Big Ten yet. It hasn't affected the Big Ten yet. I'm curious to see if over the next couple of days we see some more occurrences of this. But, that 4-game redshirt rule, I think everybody was pretty excited about the implications of kind of how you can use that to your advantage for your team, and trying to get freshmen on the field, and kind of having more options for how you are flexible with your roster. And so I think it's been a good deal for coaches, and I think it's still, no matter what, I think it's still a net positive overall, because it's good for players too. But what we're seeing this week is something that I think people had speculated about a little bit with Jalen Hurts and others, but we're seeing it play out now a little bit. And that is that, 4 games in, some of these players are saying, well, I have a chance to decide now, do I want to play out the rest of the season? Or if I have a redshirt year, do I want to sit out the rest of this year, use it as a redshirt, and, transfer somewhere else? And so we've seen a few players, like you said, Jalen McCluskey, the senior receiver from Oklahoma State, kind of the most prominent one so far, but we've seen guys from Auburn and Arkansas and Oregon and Georgia State and a few others that have lost, starter level guys, some key guys, because of this deal. And, I'm curious to see where these kids end up, whether ultimately it ends up being a good choice or not. But it is a little bit surprising to see. Like in Oklahoma State's case, this is a guy who started 22 games. He's on the cover of their media guide. They took him to media days, really a senior leader for them. And he felt like he wasn't getting the ball enough. And so he went to Mike Gundy on Monday morning and said, I'm going to set up the rest of the season and leave. And so you haven't seen a lot of that. And I'm curious to see kind of how coaches approach that with their players. But I think a lot of it's been based on playing time so far. And that's obviously a tough thing to deal with when you're a head coach in the middle of a crazy season. But, curious to see how much this takes off. But I think it's something that we'll continue to see really over the next few years as this rule kind of gets implemented and kids figure out that, after playing 4 games, they kind of have a choice there. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to take a chance somewhere else?
Yeah, definitely a fascinating thing to follow, and continue to change kind of the evolving transfer landscape that started to really evolve several years back with the grad transfer rule that we've seen a lot of quarterbacks do. I know you wrote about that as well for The Athletic over the summer. So both those pieces you have written, not only the weekly column with Stop Rate, but the 4-game transfer rule, I think are good examples of what you can get on The Athletic, especially, with the statistical analysis mixed in with some of the longer form feature writing. So I definitely recommend subscribing to Max's work on there. Lots of good stuff for sure. And now I want to look ahead to next week, week 5 in college football, and what really is the lightest slate I can remember since I've worked at BTN in terms of volume of games in the Big Ten, with only 5. Luckily, that slate is kind of saved by the Penn State-Ohio State matchup, which is absolutely massive. So before we look at the national picture and get your insight in that regard, let's start with Ohio State-Penn State. We got 2 prolific offenses that are 2 of the top 10 most efficient offenses in the country. I believe they're number 1 and 2 in scoring in the country, led by quarterbacks. We talked about Dwayne Haskins and then Trace McSorley, who are the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten. And they both have just a stupid amount of weapons at their disposal. So their defenses, I think, are more of a question mark, but their offenses, I think, are similarly explosive. What do you think differentiates these teams as they head for a clash on Saturday in Happy Valley?
I think the thing that has really, I've been really impressed by Penn State. I think that, like we talked about, the fact that Ohio State has really not had to play a close 4-quarter against anybody. I think Penn State, the way that they had to hang on against Appalachian State, and then the way they had to respond when they were at Illinois last week, I think I was impressed by just the way that they handled those situations, by the way that, obviously it helps when you have a senior quarterback leading the way, and you have a lot more confidence in your ability to dig out of any hole when you're dealing with that. But I like that Penn State has had to be a little bit more battle tested coming into this game. I like where they're at offensively, and you saw the explosion against Illinois when they got a little bit of pressure on them, and they had to kind of figure out what to do. They really rose to the occasion. And so I've been impressed by the way Penn State's handled situations like this. And so I think that they have I really would be surprised if this game ends up being a blowout, really, for either team. I think this is one of those games like we saw last year that's going to go 4 quarters and is going to be pretty wild. And obviously you're curious about, how much losing Bosa is going to impact Ohio State and kind of their potential. But honestly, when you watch Ohio State, and you can quibble over the quality of competition, but Ohio State has looked to me like a playoff team. And so this is the week when you go out and prove that to everybody. And, if Penn State's able to knock them off, I think you'd have to say the same thing about them, So I think that this is one of those, primetime clashes that will go a long way towards deciding who has a chance to represent the Big Ten in the Final Four at the end. And really just can't wait to see how it plays out. But like I said, I think it's going to be I don't know if it'll be as high scoring it was last year, but it definitely might be with the way these teams are throwing it around. I just think it's going to be incredibly close.
Have you ever been to a game at Penn State in Happy Valley?
I've visited Penn State before, but I have never been to a game out there. And I know it's going to be a whiteout. I know it's going to be a packed house. You've got game day, you got all this. So in terms of just atmosphere and pressure on Ohio State, it's going to be just peak awesomeness, I'm sure.
Yes, same. I've been to the campus, never been to a game, and the whiteout game is one that is on the bucket list that I definitely intend to get to at some point.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right, so moving on, we'll keep in the Big Ten. And I just want to get your thoughts on the Northwestern program in the middle of what's been a really difficult season for them, especially with Michigan coming to Evanston this week on a roll, and then especially the really unfortunate news that they just dropped yesterday with star running back Jeremy Larkin forced into an early retirement due to cervical stenosis. That's the spinal condition that makes football no longer really an option for him without putting his life on the line. So obviously a wise move for him to step away, as unfortunate as it was. But I just want to get your thoughts on that matchup coming up, especially in the context of Northwestern really in the middle of an unfortunate season.
Yeah, it's been a tough run for them, and I think they're one of those teams that is just trying to, kind of like we talked about with Nebraska. At this point, you're just trying to scratch and claw and find a way to get to 6 wins. And, obviously a win this week would be a huge step forward in that. But I just think that what we've seen from Michigan so far, I would expect Michigan to kind of do similar to what we saw last week and be able to get off to a hot start there and really put a ton of pressure on Northwestern. And I think that's one thing you saw in that Nebraska game that really impressed me is when you're able to put those points up, they were really able to rush the passer on 2nd and 3rd down and really get after him. And so I think if Michigan can match that start, it's going to be really tough for Northwestern, I think, to dig out of that hole. But, really, like you said, unfortunate for Northwestern. I hate to see them lose their running back like that. And, it's been definitely a challenging year so far, especially when you start the way they did against Purdue. And so still a team that's got a lot to figure out. I think it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. But at the same time, that the quality of coaching they have, I imagine they're going to still be able to find a way to get up for this game and try and give Michigan their best fight.
Yeah, you don't wish that kind of injury or condition on anybody, but especially Jeremy Larkin.
Yeah.
Meeting him in person last month, dude's just like really outgoing, really bubbly guy, fun to talk to, funny, engaging dude, and it's just, I don't know, it really just sucks hearing that. When I was kind of shocked when it came across my timeline yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. You hate that for the kid, and honestly, I hope that fans understand when it's a prognosis that serious that that he has no choice but to give it up, and that hopefully this is going to be the best for his long-term health to not put himself in danger like this. But just hope that he can recover and get back to living a good life there.
Yeah, well said. And the last game I wanted to touch on before we moved on to the national picture is that Nebraska and Purdue matchup coming up. And I know Nebraska, we can throw out all the stats that we want about how historic their 0-3 start is. Is it possible they go to 0-4 with Purdue visiting, especially after what we saw with Purdue? A result finally going their way last weekend after 3 heartbreakers. They got a win over a top 25 team in Boston College. How do you see this game playing out as Purdue tries to get some revenge from last year's loss to the Huskers?
Yeah, it's interesting. That was a really tight one last year that Nebraska pulled out at the last minute. And, I saw that Scott Frost said something to the effect that they see this one as a winnable game. And I know that they heard about that up at Purdue. And I'm sure that they are kind of licking their chops ready to really kind of, light it up on Nebraska. And that Purdue team that we saw against Boston College, I think is about right. This is a tough game, man. This, you're only a couple turnovers away from losing a game you should win. And I think that, I really like this Purdue offense. I like where they're at. Rondale Moore, obviously just incredible as a true freshman and what he's brought for them. And, I thought they had a good chance to beat Northwestern. I thought they had obviously a good chance to beat Eastern Michigan, and they hung in there with Missouri. So they were due for a nice win like that against Boston College. And, I would expect Purdue is going to put it on Nebraska and not really show any sympathy for, the new head coach in the Big Ten. And, this is, I think it will be, be close. if Adrian Martinez is healthier, then that gives them a lot better shot than it did last week when they had to pull him at halftime because he was getting beat up. But I would expect Purdue to win this, and I think that Boston College game, I think, is a good reflection of the progress they're making.
All right, Max. How about nationally? Looking at the schedule, there's some juicy ones on the slate, and Big Ten fans might have some extra viewing time at their disposal this weekend with only 5 Big Ten games going on. So, what should we here in the Midwest and Big Ten fans across the country be watching for outside of this conference?
Yeah, I'm going to be at the morning game in Lubbock, West Virginia, Texas Tech. Number 12 versus number 25. Really interesting test for the Mountaineers and Will Grier and David Sills, who've rolled to this point, had no trouble against Tennessee. They've really made I think a really nice statement against Kansas State and really blew them out. And so this is a good test for them on the road against a Texas Tech team that is suddenly up now. They've won 3 in a row. Really a massive win for them against Oklahoma State, an upset win there. So looking forward to that one. Tennessee, Georgia is always going to be a fun one. Georgia's, I think, a 32-point favorite now or something, so I would expect that one to be a blowout probably. But, I think Stanford, Notre Dame, like we hit on, that's a big one, a big test for Stanford. Notre Dame, I think, is the favorite in that one, and I'm curious to see, how Ian Book and the rest of that offense is able to kind of carry out the progress they made against Wake Forest. And then I think another one that could be, pretty, I think BYU with Washington is going to be a lot of fun. And I think Ole Miss LSU could be pretty sneaky interesting. That Ole Miss defense is terrible, but they're able to score a lot of points. And LSU offensively is still trying to totally figure out, kind of how, they're playing incredible defense so far, but still trying to figure it out with Joe Burrow offensively, how to be consistent in the passing game. So I think that late night game, 8 p.m. Central kickoff, I think that one could end up being a lot of fun.
All right, sounds good. I can't believe it's already week 5. It's flying by, and before you know it, we'll be.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, before you know it, we'll be doing the college football playoff rankings and getting into rivalry week and all that good stuff. So it's flying by. Appreciate your insight, and I want to close out with a segment I do at the end of each show called the One Big Thing of the Week, the 1G thing, which is kind of something I like to highlight off the football field, maybe a cool moment or something interesting. It could be funny. It could be whatever, and I'll start with one that I really enjoyed, and I know a lot of Big Ten and football fans across the country enjoyed seeing as well. It was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Veolia, an Ohio State band alum from, I believe, 80 years ago. He's 100 years old. When he got into the Ohio State band, it was only 1 year since the Script Ohio tradition had been formed. So he did the Script Ohio, dotting the I, the tradition they do every week at Ohio State, and he did it remarkably smoothly for an 100-year-old man, and he looked great, and it was just a really cool moment that we captured on BTN, and it kind of took off virally across the country. Also a World War II veteran, so it's kind of a complete package of a heartwarming moment. So I don't know if you saw anything across college football either this season or this past weekend in particular, but if you did, we'd love to hear it.
Boy, put me on the spot here. That was a good one. I did see that one.
And if you don't have one, I do have a backup that we can break down.
Bring it on. I'd love to hear it.
All right. Did you see Michigan State's kicker, Matt Coghlan, on a fake field goal, taking the option pitch and scoring a touchdown? I don't think I've ever seen a kicker in a quarterback option. So it was Lewerke had the hold. They ran the option, pitched it at the last second to Coghlan, who dove in. And, of course, this is the Matt Coghlan who did the slip and slide celebration, I believe, 2 years ago for Michigan State. So we've got a kicker who probably has more iconic moments under his belt than most at Michigan State.
That's awesome. I think there's nothing more heartwarming. There's nothing we love to see more in college football than ridiculous props used to celebrate turnovers, right? And so that's the thing that's been fun for me to track over the course of the season here is, obviously Miami and Alabama and all them set it off, but, more and more teams trying to find their way to get a little bit of attention for how they're doing it. Really impressed by Oregon State bringing in a chainsaw for them. That's a really encouraging one. I saw another team that was doing, I think it was Tulane was doing like a big chain of beads around their neck and stuff like that.
Mardi Gras style.
Exactly. Mardi Gras beads. Boise State with the turnover thrown. It's that's the thing. I know people kind of think that this stuff has jumped the shark and is ridiculous now, and they're probably right. But I think I kind of love how much people hate it, and I kind of love how much people are trying to come up with something that no one's ever seen before. And as stupid as they are, the kids obviously love it. So that's been fun to follow. Even though I think a lot of people are over it, I still think it's great.
Well, I appreciate that, even though people probably have grown tired of it, that I think the chainsaw is a funny adaptation even all this time later, because it started as a chain, right? So just make a chainsaw. I think it's a...
Exactly. And I think it was
creative.
I think Arizona State, they were doing they're having their guy doing like a little bit of weightlifting on the field after getting his turnover gains. So, it's ridiculous, but that's one of the reasons why we love the sport, All
right, well put, Max. I appreciate you jumping on with me today. That's all I got for you. Looking forward to another fun weekend of college football, and maybe as wacky and weird as we saw this past weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, man. Enjoy it.
Appreciate it. Let's do it again sometime.
Sounds good.
All right. All right, thanks once again to Max for joining me. Really enjoyed talking to him. Really enjoy all my conversations with folks from The Athletic. Do a lot of great work over there. So like I mentioned in the show, subscription, in my opinion, is worth your while if you haven't subscribed already. All right, moving on now to our weekly Stat Head segment with Harold Shelton. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Stat Head is a segment we do during college football and basketball season with our in-house researcher, Harold. He gets us ready for the upcoming week, breaks down the previous week of action, and does it in a way that dives behind the numbers into Big Ten football, Big Ten basketball as we move along the basketball season, and he's somebody that we love hearing from every week. So we'll get into that Stat Head segment with Harold Shelton. Discussion with H starts right now. All right, very pleased to be joined by BTN researcher Harold Shelton once again here in the studio. H, we're back for our weekly Stat Head segment, and we came off kind of a light week in the Big Ten Conference, but there was a marquee game Saturday night between Wisconsin and Iowa. So let's dive right into that. First off, though, I'd be rude not to ask, how you doing?
I'm good. Glad we got a light week this week. We had a light week last week. Kind of getting my feet under me now.
Yeah, and catch your breath a little bit. And like I said, we'll get right into that Wisconsin and Iowa matchup under the lights at Kinnick Stadium. We know what Iowa can do under those lights and how dangerous they can be. Wisconsin got out of there with a 28-17 win. It was definitely closer than the final score indicated because Wisconsin got kind of an insurance touchdown there at the end. But what did you see out of that game for both teams, especially with Iowa having an opportunity to get in that driver's seat in the Western Division and Wisconsin needing to bounce back from a really shocking loss at home the week prior?
Yeah, so I thought it was a gut check drive for Wisconsin. I mean, obviously you had all of the expectations. This is the year for them to break through and make the playoff. This is the year for them to win the Big Ten for the first time since 2012. All of that is on the line as they're 88 yards away from the end zone in the final 5 minutes. And the much maligned Alex Hornibrook comes through, is literally perfect on that final drive, leads them down, gets a score, keeps all their hopes and dreams alive that were there to start the season. I thought that the run defense was a little better than it was against BYU. I still think they have some issues overall, but they had to have this game because if they would have lost, Iowa would have had a complete stranglehold on the division. I wouldn't say Wisconsin's out of the woods by any stretch. They still have games at Michigan and Penn State, but this was a much-needed win for the Badgers.
For me, it was kind of the redemption, at least a mini redemption for Alex Hornibrook. You mentioned how he was perfect on that last drive, and it was something he couldn't do in Indy 8 or 9 months ago when they needed that drive against Ohio State. So it's just interesting to see that. Maybe it gives them some confidence going forward as you mentioned, they're not out of the woods and have some big games coming up if they do want to make this a special season.
Exactly.
All right, moving on now. I always want to get your thoughts on the Spartans, take the pulse of that program because you pay close attention to them being an alum. And they are still in the top 25. They've kind of gone under the radar a little bit since dropping that game at Arizona State. It's such a late-night game, I feel like a lot of people didn't even see it. So where are you at on Michigan State? They went into Bloomington, got a win in Indiana. Like I said, remain a top 25 team. Is there any indicators out of that program that make you feel better than maybe you were in the first few weeks of the season?
The run defense I definitely think is legit. You always kind of wonder those first couple of weeks. You know, you play spread teams that like to throw it around. But, you know, Indiana, I know their competition wasn't great, but they had at least run for 200 yards in every game, and they completely shut Indiana down, held them under 30 yards rushing. So it was good to see like the D-line really come to play. They actually got a pass rush, which they were missing against Arizona State. So that was good to see. Offensively, though, they still got major issues. I think the running backs that they had in the game, their longest run was 6 yards. That just can't happen when you're playing Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan coming up. Lewerke still, for as talented as he still has trouble holding on to the ball. A couple of bad picks, bad option read. So it's kind of give and take with him. I think they get better as they go along, so I'm hoping to see some more progression before they get to State College on the 13th, but they still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so you're still on the fence a little bit, but a fan base that has to be feeling quite a bit better than they were a week ago is Purdue. Posted a really nice 30-13 win over a top 25 Boston College team. Don't expect you to tell me how much gas cost or what the number one movie was the last time Purdue had a top 25 win. I think it was in 2011. Mm-hmm. But to me, this is kind of a course correction for that program this season after those 3 tough losses. Just a sign of the rebuild. It's still probably on track for them to be able to pull off a win like that. They're not in danger now of going. I saw some disastrous projections after they started 0-3, that would play out having them 0-5, 0-6, 0-7. So now that they've kind of course corrected a little bit, what does that win mean to you as you're kind of evaluating year 2 under Jeff Brom?
I can't put into words how impressed I was by Purdue. The fact that you lose 3 games by 8 points, all at home, and you could have won all 3. It's very easy for college kids to go in the tank. Jeff Brom had those dudes ready to play, and they jumped all over BC. You couldn't tell which team was ranked if you didn't know before the game. Purdue completely outplayed them, and I was more impressed with the defense. We know David Blau had the great game against Missouri. He followed that up with another great game against BC, but it was the defense. 4 sacks, 4 turnovers. Boston College is one of the best running backs in the nation. He didn't do anything. So I was very, very impressed with Purdue, very impressed with the coaching staff, getting those guys ready to play. And, they're kind of back on track, and they're favored this week.
Yeah, the defense was a concern for sure for them, but it's nice to see them having a rebound game. And like you said, in football, it's a sport that things can get out of hand really easily if guys give up. And it's maybe easier for guys to give up and fold than it is in other sports just because it's such a physical game and just the nature of the game, how it lends itself to packing it in. And I know there's been whispers at another program of guys maybe not buying in completely to either what the coach is preaching or, you got guys that are veterans, and that's at Nebraska after we heard what offensive lineman Tanner Farmer had to say a couple weeks back after their loss. And as we saw in their performance against Michigan, things are still not going well in their first few games under Scott Frost. So after coming off a 56-10 blowout in Ann Arbor, what's your take on how things are going there? Is this to be expected just because of the turnover, the talent that's not there yet that Scott Frost hopes to bring in? Are you worried that it goes deeper than that, or is this just a rocky start that really was from the opening kick with that rain out against Akron?
I think there's some foundational issues there. Not necessarily with Frost, it's just in terms of what he inherited. Again, this was a defense that was one of the worst in the country that he took over. And he actually made them look competent the first 2 weeks. They just ran up against a buzzsaw in Michigan last week. I was definitely surprised at how successful Michigan was able to run the ball against them, because it seemed like the first 2 weeks, they were very aggressive and shutting down the run and getting after the quarterback, and they couldn't do either one of those things this past week. I will say I was surprised that they played Adrian Martinez. I felt like I would have held him out until he was 100%. It sounded like he wasn't coming into this game, like he was well enough to play. But against that D-line, knowing your limitations is asking a lot for a true freshman who's not fully healthy to go in there and get a win. So, all is not lost, but, you don't want to be 0-4. You don't want to, come home and lose to Purdue. That's a winnable game. So if you definitely want to get that one if you can.
Yeah, and flipping it now, looking at Michigan, I know we kind of talk about this every week, what does Michigan have to show to prove that they're a contender again? I know there's skepticism there because they do this every year, and then once they get in the big game, it's a different story. Anything that you've seen so far to kind of change that opinion viewers are just going to have to wait for a few weeks until they run up against that gauntlet in the middle of the season there.
October 13th against Wisconsin. So that's what I'm waiting to see. Again, one thing I will say, under Jim Harbaugh, they absolutely pound unranked teams, like just completely kill them. And I will say I was surprised at how well Michigan ran the ball against Nebraska, because, again, Nebraska looked much better against the run the first 2 weeks, and Michigan just completely did whatever they wanted. I mean, that was no contest. The game was over in the first 10 minutes. But, again, I'll be curious to see what happens. They played 3 straight games at home, kind of got their feet underneath them. Now they're going to start facing some tougher competition, and, we'll see if Higdon and Evans in that run game can continue to thrive. And if they can't, it'll be up to Shea Patterson to make plays. In game 1, they weren't able to do that. And so I just kind of want to wait and see when they play a really good defense.
All right, fair enough. And before we move on to this upcoming weekend, we have to talk about what Dwayne Haskins is doing, because it's a remarkable start he's off to. I think he had 5 more touchdowns this past weekend against Tulane. Obviously, not the best competition with the Green Wave in Columbus, getting blown out like they were expected to. But that doesn't take away anything, I don't think, from what Haskins is doing, especially in limited time, because they're always winning by so much that they pull him out. So just give me some numbers to put in perspective the type of start he's gotten off to historically within the Big Ten and just amongst his peers.
So, the fact that he was able to go 21 of 24 for 304 and 5 touchdowns and a half is ridiculous in itself. He's over 75% completion. Before I get into all of the crazy numbers that he's putting up, I've just been impressed that he doesn't lock on to a guy. Every game they've had a different leading receiver in terms of receiving yards. Whether it's Paris Campbell last week, it's KJ Hill against TCU, it's Johnny Dixon against Rutgers. Terry McLaurin. He's spreading it out to everybody. And it just goes to show you, when you have a quarterback who can stretch the field, or with a bunch of wide receivers that can just go make plays, they just become so much more difficult to guard. But in terms of the historic stuff, keep in mind, this is his first year as a starter. He hadn't started a game before, August 31st or whatever the date was. And he's already the 3rd Ohio State guy with multiple 5 touchdown pass games already. And he has 16 touchdown passes through 4 games, which is the second most ever by a Big Ten player.
Just 1 pick.
And just 1 pick.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good ratio.
Not bad. And, definitely want to keep an eye on him this upcoming weekend as he faces his toughest test yet, most likely, against Penn State. And before we even get into that game, I just want to ask, is this the lightest week you can remember? I can't remember a weekend where we had only 5 games on the schedule. Is this has got to be one of the lightest ones, I feel.
It definitely seems lighter than normal. And I think we got 5 teams on a bye and a non-conference game. So the fact that it's so light is definitely interesting to me, but it makes it even more fun because we could just dive right into Ohio State and Penn State. There's nothing else on at night in our league, so we could just put all of our attention on that big one.
Yeah, so let's go heavy into that game and that matchup for a few minutes here. And I want to start by just getting into the history between these 2 programs, the recent history when Urban Meyer and James Franklin have been at the respective helms there. There's been some really entertaining games, and I know last time Ohio State went to Happy Valley, it was kind of that program-defining win for James Franklin and Penn State. Last year, it looked like Penn State could maybe go undefeated and roll through their schedule. They got off to that great start in Columbus, and then Ohio State answered, and J.T. Barrett was the hero on that one. So if you can kind of get into the history and not that it'll have much of an impact this upcoming weekend, but just how it might project, going forward here.
Yeah, so Urban Meyer's been at Ohio State since 2012, and he's lost 3 Big Ten regular season games. 1 to Franklin, as you said, Mark D'Antonio and Kirk Ferentz. Those are the only times that he's lost. But he could very easily be 1-3 against Penn State. That's how close these games have been. Franklin's first year in 2014, Penn State's a huge underdog. They get Ohio State on the ropes. Buckeyes have to win in double OT, and that's the year that they won a national championship. Then we talked about the 2016 game. We talked about last year. So, this rivalry has been very, very good, very competitive. And, it extends beyond just the field. These guys are going after the same players. They're both at top 5, top 10 recruiting classes every year. So, we're going to see a lot more of these types of matchups as long as these coaches are still there. So that's what makes it even more fun.
So when you look at these 2018 versions of these programs, what do you see that differentiates one from the other? Obviously, two great offenses. They are number 1 and 2 in scoring, you mentioned before we sat down here. I know they're top 10 in the country in efficiency. What do you see from, maybe the defensive side of the ball or even on the offensive side that differentiates these programs and who has the advantage?
So Ohio State, I would definitely say, is more of a vertical pass. That they have the edge when it comes to vertical passing. Haskins with the big arm, with all of those receivers. Penn State likes to do it on the ground, and it's Miles Sanders, it's Ricky Slade, and it's Trace himself. I mean, Trace has been a huge threat on the ground. I know entering the Illinois game, he was leading the Big Ten in rushing touchdowns, and he probably added to that, this past weekend. So I would say offensively they both get it done, but just in different ways. Defensively, I'm very curious to see how Penn State will stop that Ohio State rushing attack. We've seen Pitt run for over 200 yards. We saw Illinois run for over 200 yards. So I would say that the edge in the front seven will go to Ohio State. But we've seen Ohio State give up a ton of big plays. They've given up 11 plays for 30 yards or more already. Only Rutgers has allowed more in the conference. So both teams have, really good strengths, but there are some weaknesses that both of those offenses could exploit.
Yeah, I think for me it goes to the level of vulnerability each team has displayed so far. Ohio State, the only vulnerability they've shown was against TCU, and they went down in that game briefly, and they responded. The defense responded with some big plays and big scoring plays to carry them in that one. And if you look at Penn State, they almost lost to Appalachian State. I think, as we get kind of farther away from that game, people forget how really close that was, at least from the outside looking in. Penn State fans might tell a different story as far as, they probably know how close they came and recognize that fully. But then again, you look last weekend at Illinois leading them in the third quarter before Penn State woke up and blew the doors off Illinois. So they've kind of shown some shakiness in 2 games against inferior opponents that Ohio State really hasn't shown. But you consider that this is in Happy Valley, this is a night game, it's a whiteout. We've seen how that place gets for atmospheres like a game like this demand. And it's, I think going to at least provide a little bit of an advantage. I don't know if that's something that can be quantified statistically, but I have to imagine it's at least a little bit of an advantage just being at home.
Yeah, no doubt. And as we talked about in that 2014 game, that was a whiteout at night. They were a huge underdog. Like, nobody thought that game would be close, and they sent it to double OT. 2016, whiteout, night game. Same thing. Ohio State's leading most of the way. That atmosphere gets Penn State back in the game. They block the field goal. They take it back to get the program-defining win. So we've seen, that atmosphere, that stadium at night. How we always talk about Kinnick at night. It's the same thing in State College. I mean, it is a tough place to play.
All right, can't wait to settle in. Saturday night, you going to be here?
Oh, yeah, all
right,
day.
Settle in for some, maybe they'll have Lou Malnati's this time. Maybe they'll have, pinstripes, the box dinners or whatever. Either way, can't wait to settle in and watch that one in a few days here. Before I let you go, H, did want to touch on one more matchup coming up this weekend, and that's Michigan at Northwestern. And Northwestern got some unfortunate news yesterday when their starting running back, Jeremy Larkin, was forced to retire due to a spinal condition and a neck condition that, could put his life at risk if he didn't retire from the game. So that's unfortunate to hear. Northwestern also has had a rough start to the season so far at 1-2, coming off a bye week, while Michigan has kind of turned on the offense, turned on the afterburners a little bit as they're coasting through this part of the schedule. So, H, what do you look at out of this matchup? What are you looking for from each team as they've kind of gone on divergent paths here?
Yeah, I guess on the Northwestern side, even before the Larkin news, I was always wondering how the quarterback rotation would play out. We've heard that, it's kind of up to the doctors to decide how much Clayton Thorson can play until he's 100%. Now, apparently he was, 80, 85% entering the Akron game. Now he's got the bye week, so you think with an extra 2 weeks, is he 100%? Is he ready to play? Does he have the full playbook at his disposal? With Larkin out, there's even more pressure on that position, whether that's him or TJ Green, to make plays downfield with their arm, but is also with their legs. And we know Thorson was a guy who who could run the ball, especially in the red zone. He had 18 rushing touchdowns in his career, and you take that part of the game away because of the injury, they were extremely one-dimensional. Now you lose your best offensive weapon. I'm really curious to see how this Northwestern offense will play. But, again, Michigan's going on the road for the first time since the Notre Dame loss. Everybody's telling them how great they are. This could be a classic, letdown situation where, Michigan might come out flat, could still get the win, but it could wind up being a much closer game than people think.
All right, so despite having Ohio State, Penn State demanding most of our attention, we'll definitely keep an eye on Michigan, Northwestern, Purdue, Nebraska, like we said, and the other games that are playing out, the other two playing out this upcoming weekend. So, gone for almost 20 minutes. I think that's a new record.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of good stuff to talk about.
Yeah, for all the talk about the light slate coming up and some of the absence of drama last weekend, we sure, got into it a little bit, got into the meat and potatoes, and I'm sure we'll continue to as the season rolls along here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Always look forward to it.
All right. Same time, same place next week?
Yes, sir.
All right, man. Thanks for joining me.
No problem.
All right, thanks once again to H and Max for joining me. Always value Harold insight, and we always enjoy talking to our national guests as well. And Max did a great job, as my guests always do, each week here on the Take 10 podcast. Looking forward to a big one this weekend in Penn State and Ohio State. I know we talked about it at length here. Hopefully it reflected the significance of what is a game that could determine the Big Ten East, could determine the national college football playoff picture, and should be a lot of fun to watch regardless. So before we sign off here, just want to give a shout out to my producer, Julie Bronder, who's doing a great job filling in for Wes White, who Wes has been on paternity leave and actually brought his newborn son into the office today, so had the whole office transfixed on his little baby boy, cutest guy ever, and probably a future Badger tight end or power forward because the dude is big for his age. So shout out Wes, shout out Julie, and shout out Colleen Degnan as well, who was helping me out this season with producing the podcast and getting everything ready. Been a big help as well. And of course, thanks to everyone out there for listening. Having a lot of fun doing this as we roll through college football season here. It's going really fast. Hope you guys are enjoying listening as much as I'm enjoying talking every week about the sport, about the personalities, and about the games. And we'll talk to you next week here on the Take 10 podcast.